I want to make sure that I'm not doubling up, because I've done that before where I've got the YouTube page open so that I can see the live chat and answer questions, and then I realise I'm still playing on StreamYard, or like I haven't paused it. Yeah. Why can I hear myself?
It's everyone's mistake. But hey, everybody, welcome to tonight's live stream. I have Topic Thunder Kelly with me here today. And for those of my audience, I've actually had a recent influx of subscribers, so they may not know who you are. So would you like to introduce yourself and what you do on the YouTube?
On the YouTube. Yeah, so are we coming through okay? I just want to make sure I'm not lagging or anything weird.
No, you're doing fine.
Wonderful. Yeah, so my name obviously isn't Topic Thunder, it's Kelly, but I just found a humorous name for my channel, which gets confused with a particular film from several years ago sometimes, but that's okay. That's all right. Yeah, so I just talk about all sorts of stuff, really. I suppose philosophy, atheism, mental health issues, and just talking about how they all sort of can intermix sometimes. So yeah, and I've been to atheist events, and that's how I met Faye. And yeah, she's the activist type. I'm the more, oh, isn't this curious? I think I might want to talk about it sort of stuff. So she's the warrior and I'm the librarian.
I wouldn't. Okay, I don't know how to take a compliment, and that is
good.
Thank you.
Throw a million at you. So all I know.
I have briefly warned Kelly before we started this live stream that I'm actually quite not here. I've had a little bit. So I recorded my normal Friday video tonight because it takes me a long time to edit those videos. The last time I edited, it took about 5 hours. Because I do a lot of meme edits, and I put a lot of effort into those videos for whatever reason. Well, it's because it's fun, but I thought I would record it tonight, and I am absolutely hammered. I have that whole bottle of amaretto that you saw last week is gone. She's finished. She's polished. And that's how I am right now. So if I'm acting too erratic, I've told Kelly to police me, but also my audience, you are able to police me as well. But aside from my inebriation, I would like to ask you, Kelly, how you are doing in isolation. I'm trying to ask as many guests as I can how they're doing, because I do feel as though there are quite a few people struggling. So it might be, it might be helpful for people to just share how they're doing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm very lucky. I've got a fairly sizable house. I've got a little bit of garden. It's fairly secluded where we live as well. And I've got sort of rural areas around me, so we can go on our sort of daily walks and things like that. So I'm really, really lucky. And I say that despite obviously the difficulties that are present, not being able to go to work and having a routine and things like that. But it's certainly made me count my blessings as to what I do have. When things are taken away, you see what you do have. And that's pretty awesome. It's been a weird one to fathom, really. For every moment I feel I've got my head around it, something will happen and I'll just feel the enormity of what's actually happening, and more so in terms of what it's going to mean for all of us when we go back to normal, rather than just myself. And I was thinking the other night, when my little one goes back to school, I thought, do I want her to go back? Do I feel safe enough to send her back? Do you know what I mean? All these sort of odd questions that nobody can really answer. How are you going to go back to school? Is it going to be a couple of days here, a couple of days there? What's that going to do to them? Sort of their routine. She's young, so I've got that going for me, that she might not even remember all this when she grows up. So aside from that, I suppose parental fears, which are always ever present anyway, but personally I'm doing really well. It's helped me realize that the same amount of hours are in the day, and yet I'm seeing them for just how precious they are when you've almost been given more than you had before, and you've got to maintain a sort of stability, because there's really nothing you can do there's nothing you can do to make the virus go faster. There's nothing you can do to sort of, you know, you can't do the things you normally do. So you really, to me, it's actually helped me really organize myself better. Before, I thought I had all the time in the world, and now it's different. It's a hard thing to explain, but I've tried to, as you can imagine, take the positives from it.
Yeah.
So obviously not seeing family and things like that is quite hard, but thanks to technology, you know, that's not a huge gap to, you know, to bridge. So that's not been too bad. And we're homebodies in our house anyway, so it's not like we're constantly out like going to the beach surfing or anything like that. Although that's the first place we want to go when we get out, is go
That would be a sight.
Oh my god.
That would be a sight to see.
Oh gosh.
For me, I think it was kind of the opposite for me. I never felt like I had enough time because I love filling up my day. I'm one of those people who, if I get too involved in numbers, it kind of messes with my brain. And I'm one of those people who will count the minutes. Like, I'll be like, have I spent enough? Like, is there enough minutes for me to do this? And I'll try to pack as much as I can into one day just to keep myself occupied. And I don't exactly know if it's a coping mechanism or it's just like my need to constantly feel like I'm doing something. But now I've really had a lot of time to invest into creativity and what I want to do. And I guess I'm quite fortunate. I know that there are people, especially in London, who may not have, I was telling you before the live stream started, as wonderful a landlord as I do and still have to pay their rent, even though they're not getting paid by, you know, their companies and things like that. And it's absolutely horrendous. I'm one of the fortunate few who does not have that pressure on me, and I'm forever grateful. My landlord is an angel. You will never hear me talking dirt about him because he is honestly just a wonderful human being. But it really has allowed me to branch out into like my YouTube stuff and be able to focus on all of it. And as much as I don't like talking about it, because I do think that it's a little like, oh, I'm doing YouTube, you know, I do think that it is something that I'm quite good at and I'm quite passionate about. So I've been able to invest a lot of time into it. And it's, you know, it's a lot of fun for me to sit here and do that. But yeah, it's good that you are looking at the positives. It definitely feels like the new normal. Because I was talking to a coworker yesterday who we used to work in the same place. I don't know if I'm going to go back to that place, but I was talking to her and she said, can you really think that a month ago we were sitting in a restaurant, we were all hanging out together and everything was normal, and now we're like this, like we haven't seen each other in a month and we're talking over the phone and this is the new normal. And I really do think that it's a big transition, and I really don't know how people are coping. And I just hope that they're coping in some kind of way. And if they're not having such a great time, that, you know, the content that people are putting out, myself is putting out, is helping in some degree, because it can be a very lonely time. It can be a very stressful time, especially if you're a tactile person like myself. I think I said to someone yesterday, oh, it's been so long since I've shoved someone, because I'm kind of a rowdy character. I'm very familiar with people I'm familiar with. And it's just been such a long time. And it really does get to you after a while. Like, I just haven't had like a hug or like a, you know, like a handshake or a fist bump or anything like that. So I really, really do hope that everyone's doing well at home. If there's anything you want to add to that, feel free to.
No, it's amazing. I mean, as far apart as it feels like we are at the moment, I've seen it sort of get stronger and stronger and stronger every week. How people say, well, the first thing I'm going to do is hug this person, and obviously I'm talking about friends and family and people like that on my social media sort of thing. And you know, they're saying, well, the first thing I want to do is this, and the first thing I want to do is that, and it's all centered around people, not just doing things, but just being able to shake a hand and give a hug. And you know, just all these, and especially families as well, who've obviously been separated. Obviously some people have been ill and actually been in hospital and away from their families, not allowed to see them So whenever I do find myself at the moment, oh wow, this is huge, and I might feel myself getting tearful, I just think, God, it really could be so much worse. And I think you're right. I think just making sure we take care of each other's mental health. We're all in the same boat, so nobody has necessarily any answers to give. But that's not sometimes not all you need. You just need some comfort and solidarity in knowing what you're going through is what somebody else is going through. And of course, if you're at home and it's awful to think that how many domestic abuse cases have been, happening and have jumped up because, of course, not everybody lives in a happy family home. And so that troubles me a great deal. But at the same time, it's been highlighted even more. And things are coming about in terms of when this is all over to help put a focus on things. So as much as things have got worse, it's almost highlighted them as well and highlighted all the good parts. So, this was never going to be something that people were going to come away from unscathed. I think we'll all take part of it with us, but maybe there's more good to come out of it than we perhaps even know now. I think when you go through something where you could be wealthy, you could be poor, you can be obviously of different religions, different ethnic backgrounds and things like that. But when there's an equalizer like this, I think, and I've said it before in my video a couple of weeks ago, I really think it's where humanity can shine, because we can all come to some base level understanding, at least empathy. We might disagree still with politics about it, and we still might disagree with the government's reaction to it, but there's the human level empathy that I think is happening across the board, and I find that really inspiring.
I do think that disease is one of the few things that is truly impartial in the way that people react to it. So, I'm particularly concerned for my own community, the ex-Muslim community, because, Ramadan is rolling around in a couple of days. A lot of people are stuck at home with their families and they can't be themselves. So for me, it's been just the sort of driving force to keep going has always been, well, what if I'm the only person that can keep someone company? What if I'm the only person that, and I mean, that sounds a little grandiose in my brain, like having said it out loud, it does feel like, oh, I'm the hero, like I'm, but it really does feel that way, like, as well as it being, my own kind of self-satisfaction to be able to create content and fulfill my need to do something every day. I think it also serves a purpose in that, maybe someone just wants to hang out for a day, and any day that, within the last, I think this is the 34th day that I've been uploading, in the last 34 days, when I've thought, oh, maybe I'll take a break today, maybe I'll upload today, I've always thought, well, what if someone is sitting there waiting for me to upload and I'm just not there? It really does feel like a little bit of a responsibility. Obviously, it's not like overbearing. I am ultimately having fun doing this, but it's just like a little like, hey, I'm here to hang out with you. I'm just here to have a giggle with you. And I think that can go a long way, even within my own friend circles. Like, I've had people, there's quite a few people in my friend circle who've kind of gone a little bit nutty in that they're fixating on one thing. I have one of my friends who's fixating on Donald Trump, and I'm like, you need to get away from that. There are other friends who are just, stuck in their homes, haven't seen me in ages. Myself, I'm a little bit of an extroverted person, even though I can get drained quite quickly. So for me, like, not having that tactile sensation has to be replaced with other ways. So I really, really do think that pushing content and being able to, connect with people, perhaps not in a direct way, but in a slightly more indirect way, and just entertain someone and feel like you're also making a difference, is a good way of getting over the, I don't know, the isolation blues. For a drunk person, I'm sounding pretty sober.
I know. I was just like, how are you? You're
Years of training.
Not that a drunk person, I have to say. I forgot you were drunk.
I forgot I was drunk. But aside from that, to move away from this topic a little bit, the ex-Muslims of North America and also the Council of Ex-Muslims in Britain here are running a campaign year long around shunning. And I mean,
Mm.
I've spoken about that extensively. Quite a few people in our community, the ex-Muslim community itself, has spoken about shunning quite extensively. But I
Mhm.
would like to ask you, because I don't necessarily think that you've gone through any kind of
Mhm.
shunning. If you have, please do correct
Mhm.
me.
Mhm.
But I would like to say, what are your 2 cents on it? And what would you like to add to the discussion? Because I think it is a really important topic to cover, and it
Mhm.
isn't something that's widely talked about because a lot of people are ashamed of it. A lot of people are deeply scarred by it. Um, so, what do you have to add to this sort of forum of discussion?
Well, like you said, I don't have any personal experience with it because I didn't grow up religious. My family wasn't religious. So I'm a little bit of an anomaly in the
Mhm,
community, really. I'm a bit more outside looking in rather than having been sort of in the battlefield, as it were,
mhm,
and then coming out. So to me, it's very easy to say that's an awful thing to do. It sickens me in so many ways, but at the same time, I think when I've really had a chance to think about it, it's so integral to the human psychology to have. Obviously, indoctrination is just so powerful,
mhm,
and it can. You've experienced it yourself. I've obviously seen your stories and things you've expressed on your channel, and to think that familial relationships can become so toxic and become so unbalanced is just frightening to me, and it's really awful because all you're doing, you're not changing yourself fundamentally. All you're doing is sort of breaking away from initially perhaps a train of thought that other people follow, and then you might start removing yourself from the cultural aspects and the worship aspects and things like that, and then all of a sudden it seems like there's this huge disparity between who you are supposed to be and who you are now. And it's not that it doesn't happen in secular families, but it may be some more down to immoral behavior, and you're the black sheep, as it were, or you don't come from a very loving, very stable family, and you end up being the one left behind. So there's aspects to it, but religion has this really sort of odd I'm trying to think of the word to describe it, but it's it's a duplicitous thing because you
mhm,
have the aspects of people and a family, or a group holding themselves up to a certain standard, including a moral standard, an ethical standard, even standards of a familial structure by saying, our family is stronger for being part of this religion, our family is better than yours, for a lack of other term, for following this cult or for following this way of thinking, and yet will do one of the worst things that a family member can do to another family member, not just one, but your parents, your brothers and sisters, people you've spent time with and grown with and formed bonds with,
mhm,
immediately do that. And it's just, where's the understanding? Where's it's like flicking a switch, and psychologically it's
mhm.
fascinating, but my fascination with it obviously doesn't help people who are experiencing it.
I mean, I think to call it fascinating, fascination is by far one of the most impartial emotions that I've ever felt.
Mm.
Because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're fascinated in a positive or negative way.
Mm.
And I think it's fair to say that it is a fascinating sort of trend, I guess. Um, in terms of why the family do it, it's definitely a method of trying to break the person who is, going through this decision. It is a
Mm.
method of trying to keep them within a specific kind of tribe or
Mm.
a particular mentality because they
Mm.
will lose everything if they leave it.
Mm.
And that makes it
So it's
all
come
the more
from a place of
difficult.
caring almost in their eyes.
It's coming from a place of don't change our roots or we'll cut you off and you're a black sheep and you're going to poison the well,
Mm.
or so to speak. I mean, particularly the argument that I've heard over and over again, and even the arguments that I used to make when I was, particularly religious, was that if this person who is an apostate comes near children and things like that, they might get ideas, and they might be misguided. But my argument for that is that if your religion is the truth, then there shouldn't be a problem. That will ultimately, truth will ultimately shine through all of that. It's not something that should change the way that your children think if it is the truth. And and then there's other arguments to make, like, well, Allah guides who he wills and things like that. Like these are things that we used to say as Muslims, and it's just, I don't know, I'm still coming to grips with the idea that family, because family is such an integral part, especially for me growing up. Family was such an integral part of me growing up. It's something that I was told to respect no matter what. It was something that I was meant to fight for, regardless of the odds, regardless of what they did to you or how they treated you. And while that is a very cruel, one-sided message, it really speaks to the hypocrisy in certain people when I'm going off the rail and they can no longer stand by me, if that makes sense. Because I think one of the things that was constantly told to me while I was being shunned was that you reported your father. How could you report your father? And it was just a case of, well, he almost killed his daughter. Is that not a bigger crime? But because he's a man, and it does also play into, like, masculinity and the patriarchal system within certain family structures and certain religions. It was just a case of, like, well, he's the head of the household and he must have had, like, a good reason for doing it and things like that. Because he's in power, that gives him the right to be able to take those extreme measures even if they're wrong. And there's no one in my family that's denying that it was wrong, but the cardinal sin was that I was even more wrong for raising a hand, or the hand of justice, or whatever you want to call it, to him, because he's the authority, if that makes sense.
It's oh my gosh, I could go on all night, but I don't understand where people feel the right to claim a position they haven't earned. He made you. He brought you up and he fed you. He doesn't. That doesn't give him rights over your physical safety. I just find that so bizarre.
Well, coming from, like, being from Bangladesh, my mother was from Bangladesh, my whole family, aside from all of my siblings perhaps, were from back home, where this kind of mentality kind of existed, that your physical body is not your own, sort of thing. Your physical person belongs to your parents as long as they're alive, because they give you, well, I'm not entirely sure how to explain it, because it doesn't really make sense in a Western context where, individualism is very much a structure within society, but the community and the benefit of the community is often held above the benefit of the individual in societies like, the Bangladeshi community and South Asian cultures. And when you consider that, it does kind of make sense how they sort of keep people in line, because it's the benefit and the status or the honor of that community that needs to be upheld. But when you translate that into an individualistic context, it doesn't make as much sense, because people don't have that same right over their own person as they would in a community context. I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
Again, for somebody who's inebriated, you're doing quite well.
Yeah, for some reason, when I get high or when I'm drunk, I'm just big brain. But to continue what I was saying, so for example, in Islam, the notion of obeying your parents is in line with obeying God. Like, Allah himself has mentioned himself next to the obedience of parents several times in the Quran. That is how important it is. It is actually a major sin to disobey your parents unless they go directly against the command of God or his messenger. So that kind of standard for the obedience of a parent is almost divine. It's on par almost with a divine command, if that makes sense. And it's kind of similar to a husband's right over their wife, but that's a whole other conversation. But when it comes to the father especially, I mean, there is this narration that Muhammad made that you obey your mother 3 times above your father and things like that. But the thing is that because the mother is in constant obedience of her husband, it doesn't really make a difference. And in an like an ideal Islamic structure. So this obedience to your parents is such a hallowed thing that if you go against them or if you challenge your parent, it's almost as if you're going against something, the implication is that you're almost going against something divine.
Well, then, yeah, then I can sort of get in the mindset, I suppose, of why that, when you did report him, why that happened. And it's not just because I have obviously a moral questioning about it and an ethical questioning about it, and certainly a cultural one. It doesn't mean that I don't understand that that's how it goes. I do. My incredulity is not to be ignorant of it, but to sort of see it as my culture.
Fair enough.
I've been lucky enough to live in other countries when I was smaller. I come originally from London, so I've been around lots of different cultures and subcultures, multicultural areas as well. So it's very interesting to look at it from a sort of anthropological sort of aspect and a psychological aspect. But I'm less. How can I put this? I'm less about understanding the cultural necessity. They obviously think it must be a necessity in order to maintain what they consider a balanced community. But when it comes to any form of abuse, any sort of cultural understanding goes out the window. And that sounds really sort of quite sort of argumentative and perhaps anti-theist in a sense, but it's not that. It's just you can give credence to something even if you find it quite despicable. You can still understand that it's a cultural thing. In order to understand it more, you have to understand the cultural basis for it.
So I have a regular to my streams. He's a bit of a fan of me. I think he just enjoys spending time on my live streams. And he said that no, your body belongs to God because he created it. And that's the general sort of mentality of people within our community. I mean, he's done half the work for me, really. But that's the general mentality, that you don't have a right to choose what happens to your body because God lays down those rules. I mean, there's definitely.
I'd like to hear from him, and not the convenient patriarchal structure that's been put in place.
Well, because he's set a patriarchal kind of system, it's understood that the patriarchy would be in power of that. But I mean, I don't want to use buzzwords, but that's essentially what it is. Yeah, it is something I think that is difficult to understand or grasp from like a liberal context where you have individualism and that is kind of hailed as the standard of how people should live. And I think that individualism should be how one should live. You should be able to first be able to maintain yourself and then be able to reach out to others around you, because it makes sense from that context. But unfortunately, in many South Asian cultures, in many for lack of a better term, other cultures who are not so liberal and value the like the right of the community over the right of the individual, it's very, very hard to understand that without the given context of where that comes from, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. It's you don't want to sound sort of uninformed of certain things. But when something is as visceral as violence, especially against children or against women or against men, it obviously awakens an emotional reaction in you, as rational as you can be. And certainly for me, children is my thing. I just don't understand it. What my question is that when does a community become so poisoned by these types of actions, whether they're used to them or not, that the sort of adage of saying it's for the good of the community starts to crumble? Or is it a level of sort of cognitive dissonance beyond anything that I can understand? And perhaps it is, because of course it just keeps happening. This narrative keeps going down through generations, through generations, through generations. I think technology is probably helping people realize that actually our ways aren't necessarily the best ways, maybe. But at a great cost. So
I think that first of all, I would like to highlight Sarah Michelle. She's said that parents can be abusive, parents can be manipulative to children, can manipulate children to hold their set of beliefs, and the parents are not always right. And I agree with her. I also kind of low-key want to just shill her channel. Please go and follow her. She's wonderful. But yeah, and also follow Kelly. She's, I love her. She's like my virtual mum. And it's just great to catch up with her. But in terms of parenting, I mean, as someone who like held a parenting position, and you yourself being an actual parent, I wanted to ask you actually what you think about like this very restrictive style of parenting. Because I always, whenever I talk about domestic violence and things like that, I think that there is often, especially in terms of children, if it's in terms of spouse on spouse, then there tends to be more of an agreement that that is wrong. But when it comes to child abuse, when it comes to disciplining children, there always seems to be this disagreement in whether or not that is something needed, something correct, or something that is vile and should be held only in the past. Many times I've talking about like my own experiences, and I wasn't a child at that point. I was a full-grown adult when that happened. But my experiences with domestic violence, and it's always sort of the same kind of people who come along and say, well, like my father did this to me, or my mother did this to me, and it taught me something, like it helped me grow from something. I don't know what you think of that as a parent, and what you would advise on that front, on how you would deal with your own children. I mean, I don't want to put a spotlight, and feel free not to answer if you don't want to. But
oh gosh, I mean, I suppose, like I've said before, when it comes to children and any religious, any political issues, any cultural issues that they face, I take very seriously and have no sense of humor about, and I don't apologize for that. Children, I just want to begin by saying the human right, as we understand it, to have children is not something I think that should be taken away, and I don't think it should be policed. But there is something to say for education in terms of being a good parent. And there's all sorts of things that I could recommend, possibly, that would, because of course a lot of people say, well, if it's anybody's right to have children, then anybody can. A paedophile could have a child, these sorts of things, these questions, and they're right. But in answer to that, to me, parenting was always, is, and will always be a privilege and not a right to me, because as much as it was a decision made on her behalf, in a way, to bring her into this world, it is my job from the moment she was born till the moment I stopped breathing, to take care of her, to teach her, to love her, to bring out the very best I can in her, so that she adds to the world and doesn't take away from it. So I do believe that being a parent is a privilege and not just a right. In answer to the abuse side of things, I think depending on the level and the type, if it's a case of, you know, it's written in your holy scripture that you're allowed to chastise your children, and things like that. And fairly recently, there's been discussions on whether or not smacking should be banned and things like that in the UK. You know, we're still having these discussions, and nothing good comes of violence. It really doesn't.
Yeah.
Education in every aspect is the key, and moving forward, that's what we need. I'm sure people will say, oh, I was given a smack or two and I turned out okay. Did you though? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Every time I was struck as a child, and not for a good reason.
I certainly think that the whole narrative of I was given a smack or two and I turned out fine is very much a coping mechanism in order to justify and then later perpetuate the same behavior.
Yeah.
Which I don't think that that's a good way of growing from something. I'm particularly terrified of having children, just because I have this sort of narrative in my brain that what if my child becomes the next Hitler, and I don't want to be the mother of the next Hitler, which is a little crazy, and I will admit that that is a delusion that I hold. But it is a very serious question in my brain, and then it goes into also the morality of having a child. You know, like would it be moral for me to have a child when, you know, like procreation isn't technically something we need any longer, and there are several children without homes, and it's just like constantly going up and down. My brain is just, this is what I think about at night when I can't sleep. Like any night where I'm woken up and I say I haven't slept, that's why. It's just because I've had the responsibility from a very young age of looking after children, and you know that necessarily was not my choice. And then, you know, growing up in that environment and then coming away from it, having my children taken from, or, you know, in quotations, my children taken from me, has also opened my eyes to another fear. Like, what if I do have a child and then they're taken away again? Would I be able to deal with that kind of pain again? And there are like a lot of questions and a lot of, you know, psychology behind that, I guess. But in terms of the discipline aspect, I would never deign to call myself a pacifist. In terms of morality, I'm very much nihilistic. I think that there are very few things that you could categorize as immoral and moral, because I understand that there are often justifications for things that you do. And I think that most people have justifications for the choices that they make and why they do the things they do. You know, for example, killing a human being, I can understand that there might be, you know, certain gray areas for doing something like that. One thing that I will say is completely immoral is slavery or enslaving someone else. I don't see a justification for that, so that is something that I can categorize as immoral. But if there are certain gray areas, I would be very cautious of calling something like that immoral. Because for me, placing that label on an action really does kind of put it down to, you should never do this under any circumstance. That's what that word means to me. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm certainly not a philosopher or an epistemologist or whatever. But that's how I kind of view the world. And when it comes to violence, for me, it is definitely very gray. I know that I've come across certain instances of my life where I would have thought that violence was necessary, you know, in the instance of, you know, my father attacking me, in the instance of other people in my family attacking me, where something like that was necessary. But when it comes to, you know, using your power as an adult, as a parent to a child, to discipline them with violence, it really feels as though it's a very unfeeling thing to do. It's a very cold thing to do. That instead of, so like something my father used to say, for example, is that don't talk to children. They don't understand anything. And I think that that is a very dumb way of understanding the mentality of a child. Obviously, they don't understand everything. They're a child. That is their entire purpose and existence. Their whole for example, when I did something wrong as a child, I was brought up to think that, oh, I should own up to this immediately, because if I don't, then I'll be punished with hell. And I don't necessarily think that that's a good way of going about it either. But I think that this need to be able to admit that you're wrong is a good thing, if that makes sense. Obviously for the wrong reasons, but I think that the idea that when you do something wrong, you're able to admit it is something good, ultimately. So I think that being able to converse and having a connected relationship with children, I mean, me as an educator as well, being able to connect with children and being able to have a conversation and allowing them the space to think and explore the way that they think about things is really, really important. And when you smack a child upside the head, it doesn't really teach them much besides, oh, if I do this, there'll be pain. But the moment that consequence is out of the way, like for example, if I die and my child is just there, there is no longer a consequence, like a physical consequence for that child, and they haven't learnt anything really. So that's I don't know. I feel like I've explained that to death.
No, you've elucidated beautifully, because what I was saying, sometimes the word education can seem like such a broad term, and what I mean by that is that I had my daughter 5 years ago. She'll be 6 this year. Well, the moment she was born, nothing can prepare you for it, and you can think about the kind of parent you want to be beforehand, but until you're in it, it's the most unique situation, and one that you can't experience it until you're experiencing it. So for that, I don't blame anyone for going a different way, steering in a different direction, finding it incredibly hard. It's an immense responsibility, and that's one of the reasons why I treated it with such respect, because I've never said to anybody who's come to me saying, I don't think I'll have children, it didn't occur to me to shun them, because it's never a societal thing, because I'm the one that's going to be raising her, not society. So to me, it would be a very specific set of circumstances. Are you financially stable? Are you in a good relationship? Are you healthy? Do you want to raise children? Do you want to give this sort of time to children? These are all questions that you really do have to ask yourself. And I don't think, and this is not to throw shade, but I don't think a lot of people do. I've known people in my life that seem, at least from the outside, to make the decision somewhat on a whim, and decisions based upon your own sort of your own circumstances is fine, but when you are bestowing them upon somebody who obviously has to be raised and can't take care of themselves, you have a responsibility to make sure that things in your life are pretty darn good as they can be. So that's the very first responsibility, is making the decision for the right reasons. But I oh my gosh, I didn't have the worst childhood, but I didn't have the best childhood either. I was physically abused and mentally.
I really don't think anyone had the best childhood.
No,
I think everyone's got shit in their childhood.
No, when I say that, the reason I say that is because my bones weren't broken. I wasn't burnt. Wasn't sexually abused. I wasn't. It was fairly. I don't know if this is even a term, but it was a fairly standard level of physical abuse. Can't believe I've just said that, but it's hard to
standard level. Well, like a spanking or a smack, or I don't know.
Yes, and fairly regularly.
Not to minimize it or anything, but
no.
It is what's known as a standard level of.
Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like, sort of, it was 3 slaps a week. It wasn't. It varied. It did vary. Looking back, I realised that my mum was a single parent. She had lots of difficulties, and it, obviously we were dealt with. A lot of the frustrations she had were put upon us children, and we've never really discussed it, but she has become a changed person, and so I haven't had the easiest life. And so I did have the same concerns myself. I wondered, would I have this streak within me? I can have a fiery temper. I can get frustrated easily. But I knew that that's something that I didn't want to become. And I think if you've got enough, I'm not the strongest person in the world, but I think if you've got enough sort of respect for the choices you make, you can raise a child that can have a life that you dreamt of as a child. And that's exactly what has happened. I think people just assume when I speak or when I'm talking about how much I respect humanity and all these sort of positive things that I look at, that I haven't seen the dark side, and I'm just la la la, going through life all Pollyanna, and I'm not. I have seen awful things, and I've had friends who dealt with awful things. But if humanity and humans have an incredible way to be able to take what's been difficult and just with a bit of effort and perhaps a little bit of help and some tenacity can break through. And you're one of those people who has. You've come, like you
Don't
said.
do that. I'm already on the verge of
No,
tears.
true. I've said this to you before. People like Self and Saffron, all these people, you've bust through. You've broken through a cultural hold on not just on what happens in your daily lives, but the way your minds have been developed to believe in such a way and to behave in such a way, or have people, the way they behave, affect you. And yet you've come out of it. You see it from the other side. You're able to explain to people like myself, the issues with it, while still being empathetic to what's going on. So, our whole lives can help us understand other people's, I think.
Well,
But physical abuse has no place. It has no place. I'm sorry. It just, if you have to hit, if you have the energy to hit, you're a lazy educator.
you shouldn't be a parent, in my opinion. I do genuinely think that my father was never the kind of person who was fit to be a parent. He was always too sort of involved with himself. And well, two things. I think the first thing is that I don't really blame people who justify their own sort of abuse that their parents put on them. Because I understand that it's very, very difficult for you to go out of your way to blame someone you love for something that they did. But at the same time, I also think that criticism is such an integral part of showing love and care and respect for somebody. Like if I am criticizing you, for example, I would never go out of my way to do that unless I really, really deeply cared about you. Because people often mistake the opposite of love to be hatred, and it's not, because hatred is kind of on the same wavelength, if that makes sense. The opposite of love is complete indifference. It's when you completely stop caring and thinking about that person. Hate and love, there's a fine line between them, I think. And that is I've constantly had this sort of struggle with my own father, and not so much with my mother, because we never had like a very connected relationship. We weren't very similar people, but I mean, I did love her, and I think she did place the tools in front of me to be a, if anything, a successful woman. But aside from that, the other thing is that my biggest fear with having children is that I see a lot of my father within myself. He was a big talker. I look like him. I have a lot of his features. He could talk for days. He was very good at putting on a face. He was very, very good in stressful situations. He was very, very good at getting a job done, finishing a job, and I see a lot of him in me. And my biggest fear is, what if that streak of narcissism or pathology or psychosis is also running through me? And if I have a child, what if I become like that? And there are certain thought processes that I have within my brain that I've constantly questioned, and that's why I sort of value introspection, because it was something that my father never did, and it's something that I invest a lot of time into. And I think a lot of my friends don't really understand. I think that a lot of them will say, well, there's nothing wrong with you, you don't need to do that. But for me, I think that self-policing and self-correcting is is extremely important, which is why I allow all of my critics to be on my live stream. I also allow them because I know they're lonely and they genuinely enjoy being critics of me. And I allow them in the comments, I allow them on Twitter. I think that this ability to allow people to critique you and for you to internalize that to an extent, I know some of it can be toxic, but to an extent is very, very important for self-development and self-correction. And for me, for example, one thought process that constantly goes through my mind is that if I had a child, I value strength, like as a physical characteristic as well as a mental characteristic, so much that what if I'm like a tiger mom that won't allow my child to be able to, have weak moments and be weak. Whereas, myself, one of the ways that I constantly build up myself is, oh, you can get over it. It's fine. Let's move on. But I understand that for a child to process that might be extremely difficult because they don't necessarily know what's going on. And I, as a child, did not necessarily know what's going on, and that's kind of why I don't know. I know I'm having a mother's meeting right now, but like I don't know how to like process that normally. And to be fair, any sort of massive crisis that has happened in my life, I've been able to process or put away extremely quickly. So my last two breakups, I was over them in a week. My mother's death, I saw it coming maybe like 11 months prior. I didn't get over her death until 5 years later because I just put it into the back of my mind. But I really do value my own mental capability to, get up and keep going. And I think that it is something that I would find, sad to put on a child, but I also feel like I would put on a child because it's something that I value.
It's like I said before, it's something that you truly will not know the kind of parent you'll be until they're here. And you've got to...
That's scary.
Yeah, exactly. But you've got to ask so many questions beforehand, and I so appreciate you being so open and expressive in these questions, because they're exactly the questions you've got to ask yourself. But I do find it, I think the fact that as you were telling me about how your father was and how you're worried you were going to turn out similarly to him as a parent, you couldn't have said two more opposite things, because you were explaining how different you were to him, and being able to articulate why he was wrong and why you found it difficult. It's miraculous. You could have fallen down the same rabbit hole and become this very hard, unfeeling person. And
I was a very hard, unfeeling person.
I'd much rather somebody worry about not being a good parent than just thinking, I'm going to be the best parent in the world, I'm going to do things this way, that way, blah. It's a constant thing. Nobody can ever prepare you. There's the lack of sleep, all those other things. The thing I can never prepare you for is how you will feel emotionally. You will have something that is half your heart. It's the only way I can explain it. And it's definitely a foreign concept to me to have somebody who or know somebody whose family members treated them as if they were strangers. That's always going to be strange to me. So
I can understand why that would be strange to you.
You're not the only person to explain that to me, but you're also not the only person. I have a friend who, I won't mention his name because he could be in some danger, but he is currently in Iraq and lives there. He doesn't really want to live there. He's actually from the West originally, but his family is Muslim, and his parents, from what he's described to me, are just so awful. They're really, really awful. Unfeeling, uncaring. You follow their rule, to the letter, and he feels no warmth for him and his siblings. And
this is something that I kind of wanted to touch on a little further as well. I mean, you being a family person, you having children, a lot of the people that I've brought on are quite young. They don't have, progeny.
Mm.
They don't have family.
Mm.
And I think that there is something that is quite there is something magical about family. I will say this. Like, even within my own family, even how horribly they've treated me, like,
Mm.
I can't get rid of them from the back of my mind. Like,
No.
there are people that have treated me awfully from the beginning of my life, who've been friends, bullies, whatever, and they're gone. Like, I don't even remember their names.
Mm.
But the people who have treated me the worst are my family, and I cannot forget them. And
Mm.
that is simply because of the bond that you create with these people. They're the people that create your most formative memories, your most formative experiences. All of your childhood memories include these people, and those are
Mm.
things that you hold forever unless you
Mm.
completely repress them and you don't remember your childhood.
Mm.
Which, actually, for me, there are loads of gaps in my memory,
Mm.
because I've suppressed so much of it. Um, but I was trying to explain this to one of my friends who's quite liberal. He actually behaves a lot like he's my dad,
Mm.
because he like gives me a lot of like emotional support, and we just he just takes general interest in me. I can't trust him to critique me because I know he will always give me a good review regardless of what I do, and he's just the way that he is. He
Mm.
is my comfort blanket in many cases, because I just go to him to make sure that I'm doing okay. But he's always said that he's never had that kind of preciousness around his family, because his family were never that kind of family. They were always like, oh, if you like us, you like us; if you don't, you don't, kind of thing. And if
Mm.
you don't want to associate with us, that's fine. We don't
Mm.
care. But with my family, because of all the time and work I feel like I invested into them, like, I've taken care of my aunts, I've taken care of my
Mm.
cousins, I have looked after my grandfather and things like that. Like, you create this bond with them where you think that no matter what, these people are always going to be around.
Mm.
And it is it could not be further from the truth. um, because it was such a fickle, like, it wasn't even the religion thing that they decided to disregard me for, to abandon me for. It was very much, bless you, by the way.
Mm.
It was very much a case of, oh, she doesn't want to get married. Well, she's gone. She reported her father. She's gone. It was for very much less than she's completely denouncing our whole way of life, which, I mean, from an atheistic point of view, might not be a lot, but from a religious perspective,
Mm.
is a lot.
Mm.
Instead of being rejected for everything that this family stands for, you are rejected for one aspect of
Mm.
it, be that arranged marriage, be that
Mm.
your sexuality, be that who you disobey, or
Mm.
who you choose to disobey, or who you choose to report, or whatever. Um, it just it, and I think that family in and of itself, so in terms of my nuclear family, in terms of my mother, my father, and my siblings, there is this coldness to it, in that there isn't this instilled level of love. Like, for example, I've never seen my parents kiss. My mother's only hugged me maybe once. My father's never hugged me in my life that I can remember. Actually, no, I think he hugged me once on the day of my mother's funeral. um you know I would be told off for giving too much love to my siblings, or like playing with them too much, or kissing them, or hugging them too much. It is something, there's something awfully militaristic and awfully cold about this family structure, and I'm not entirely sure why. If it's meant to leave you with a sense of, oh, I need love from this, and I'm going to constantly see if I can get it, and I'm going to constantly see if I can make these people proud in order to get it, or if it's just a case of, if I disobey, or if I want to leave, it will be easy for me to leave. I'm not entirely sure.
Mm. It's funny that given the level of okay, I know I keep saying indoctrination, but I'm assuming that your parents had the same sort of attitude
Mm.
towards their upbringing as they had to yours. They might have been slightly more warm. They may have been even colder.
Mhm.
But the fact is, despite whatever the routine of daily life is for people, give it be it sort of religious or cultural or whatever, it's very telling that we all look for this intangible thing
Mhm.
that we call love, or even in your case, the slightest bit of affection.
Of
You can
affection, yeah.
yeah, you can become numb to it. You can become a bit like violence. You can become numb to the violence, and that can stop working. Or you can become numb to the fact that you might need love. But the fact that on some level, you do crave it enough, perhaps to question your upbringing, to question your daily routine and the status quo, and indeed the very sort of structure of your parents and the
Mhm.
patriarchal nature of it. It's a very powerful thing, because essentially you've just explained how you had a very unaffectionate upbringing, and yet it's obviously something at the same time you probably craved a great deal as well.
Well, to be fair, I still crave it. Sometimes I will meet somebody and for on some level I'll want to make them proud, and I don't know where it's coming from or how
Mhm,
it's become that way. Sometimes it's just the energy they're giving out,
mhm,
sometimes it's just the words that they're saying.
mhm,
I mean, I don't want to name names and I'm not going to, but there were certain people that I've met in the last year, 2 years, that I've just felt this need to make proud, and I don't know where it comes from, and I don't know. And whenever they gave me any kind of I don't want to say like validation, but any kind of praise,
mhm,
it felt like, oh, I'm doing good. I've done good. Like
mhm,
it feels like something I should have gotten, but I never did get.
mhm,
That's not entirely true. I did get some of it,
mhm,
but it was never to the level that I feel now. I think the most prominent emotion that I felt when I was living back then, this is awfully sad, and I do not want to bring the mood down, but it would often just be fear. Like you were made to fear your parents, and fear was used as like a way of respecting someone. And it was this thing, like I remember my father telling me a long time ago, when we used to have a lot of discussions about God, and my dad was different to a lot of dads that are in our communities, because he was ultimately he was my best friend, and we could have quite informal conversations. um but we were talking about God one time, and he said that you can't just love God, you have to also fear God, and you have to be able to balance it like a bird flies on one wing and another. So love and fear come together, you can't have one without the other. And I think it was also his way of saying that you can't love me, you can't respect me unless you also fear me. And I think that that is something really, really disturbing, in a way, that you have to respect somebody in order to love them. And I've said this on several occasions. I've said this in several different videos and several different podcasts, that love isn't something that I truly understood or felt in terms of received until I completely left my family, and I had a first relationship. It just wasn't something that I could comprehend. Joy was also something else that I couldn't fully comprehend. It wasn't something that I experienced. I used to describe it, back when I felt it, as like euphoria. Like I felt like I was high. I did not feel like what a normal person might feel as joy, because it just wasn't something that not only we weren't allowed to feel, but it was something that was almost disliked. Like, you shouldn't be feeling that, because this world is a prison and you have to follow all these rules, and joy is something that you keep for an afterlife. I don't know if any of this is making sense. Just
mhm,
stop me whenever. But it wasn't until after I left religion, after I left my family, that joy was something and love was something that I felt. And it wasn't even something that I felt like I was allowed to feel. It was just something that I felt. And my best friend at the time, well, she's still my best friend, she's almost like a sister to me. She was, I was experiencing this, and she was in the room, and she kind of looked at me and she said, "This is completely normal. Like, this is you're normal for feeling this." But when I first sort of went through it, if we can call it that, it was almost as if I was having a mental breakdown. Like, I did not understand what I was feeling, and I couldn't fully process it, because it was just something that I was never, in a certain sense, allowed to feel. Um, and it was particularly in some ways quite traumatic, but it was also just this something very new to me. It was a whole, for lack of a better term, is a whole new world for me. And it's very, very difficult to explain to somebody who's just sort of had that throughout their life. Because when you think about it, like, these kinds of emotions are very normal for people to have, like love and joy and happiness and being able to do whatever you want. But when you live in such a restricted kind of environment where fear is the dominating emotion, where fear is something that is hallowed and something that you are meant to feel, something that you are told you are meant to feel, it is really, really difficult to sort of transmit that to somebody who just does not understand how that works.
Sometimes you have to be told something so fundamentally awful as to be able to. There is some truth to the thing of, from an outsider's point of view, I might be able to express a particular thought or a particular solution to a problem if I'm on the outside looking in. And of course, the secular families are held to the same issues in a lot of ways. They're, abusive. They can be abusive in so many different ways, emotionally, mentally, physically. It just depends on the catalyst. It just seems that in some religions, some cultures, that is almost vehemently expressed, that's how you raise children. Whereas more often, I'd say in secular sort of things, it's likely either a pattern from many generations, or it's down to specific, or quite specific reasons. There's very few sort of atheists, I think, who would put their hands up, who are abusive parents, because none of us are perfect, who would put their hands up and say, well, I did it because I don't believe in God. It's not something that powers our decisions in that aspect. But it's, I think, just by my saying, it might be very easy for me to say, my gosh, that's awful. How could he do that? Da, 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 da. But at the same time, it's although it does seem very foreign to me in every aspect of the word, it's almost easier to understand in the context of a religion, and certainly in the case of a generational thing, where it's almost tied into the very fabric, literally, of the culture. And you're expected to be a certain way. And he likely had moments of introspection, perhaps in his youth before he became a father. And perhaps he didn't really want to become a father. Perhaps he had ideas of what he wanted to do. And because obviously it was expected of him. And on goes the pattern, on goes the sort of pushing of these ideals, when really he could have turned into a great person, perhaps still holding on to his religious beliefs, but not going through that system of having children and having the sort of responsibility of allowing the sort of the generational issues to carry on. That's, something perhaps I can be slightly empathetic without having obviously known the man as you have. I've got to be empathetic on some level, because I don't think most people are monsters. I think there's usually a lot of reasons as to why people act.
There's a lot of, it's impossible for me to be unbiased, to be fair, because first of all, he's my dad, and second of all, he almost killed me. But there is this constant dichotomy that I have within my brain, because I have a lot of respect for the memory of my father, if that makes sense. Like, I know the kind of person he was. He certainly had a way with words. He had this potential, like, he would have been a brilliant con man. I can see that in my brain, because he had this amazing way with words. He was able to manipulate people and bring people around. He would have been, for example, an amazing storyteller. I think that was something that was to his merit. He could, and I've taken on a lot of that. Like, I certainly have a way with words, and I've certainly absorbed some of that within myself. And I see the potential there, but at the same time, while I can make excuses for him and I can be like, oh yes, he was a product of his own society, he was an adult, and he it wasn't as if he didn't know what he was doing. He had the capability to feel remorse for what he was doing. My father's way of apology would always be he would make me a meal and I would refuse to eat, and then he would force me to eat it. That was his means of apology. And
Mm.
those things existed, but he never understood words like I'm sorry, or acknowledgement that he did something wrong, or thank you for doing that for me. It was just not within it. Not only wasn't within our vocabulary, but it also did not exist within our specific pattern of culture.
Mm.
um the only, for example, in my language, we have a lot of different dialects or a lot of different ways of speaking our language, and the only way I know how to say thank you is in the proper, like the posh type of way. I don't know how to say thank you in the dialect that I speak, because it was just not something that was ever said in our household. um Sorry was another thing we never said in our household. It just wasn't, if a parent did something, it was understood that you either deserved it, and if you didn't deserve it, you would never get an apology. It was just never something that was acknowledged or heralded, because parents above all, they have the authority, therefore they're always right regardless. um my mother kind of perpetuated the same thing. She certainly wasn't on the same level as my father, and I would never put them on the same level, because my mother, ultimately, I did see a shift in her a lot. I saw a shift in her moving away from culture and trying to not necessarily become more modernized, but becoming a little bit more lax, especially as she aged, and she was ultimately closer to her death. Um, but there is this dichotomy of, so something that kind of popped in my head as you were speaking was that after I had reported my father, a lot of family members had approached me. I had several interventions and they were all horrible. But a lot of family members approached me and said, our fathers did this to us. Our family members did this to us. My brother did this to me. My grandfather did this to me. And we never said a thing. We never told the police. We never even told another family member. It's always been, in the back of our minds. One of my aunts actually said, while I was pregnant, my father locked me outside our home and I stood there all night and I never said anything about it. And I remember hearing all these stories and looking at them. And back in the day, that was before I was an outspoken person, before I could, articulate as well as I do now. I just I did not have the capacity to talk back to my elders, because that's how I was raised. It just wasn't something we did. It wasn't within, like, my voice would literally get caught. I could not get the words out to say them. But in the back of my brain, I could I would stand there and I would listen, and I would like silently cry as they were telling me these stories.
Mm.
And I would think to myself, they think that they they don't necessarily think that they deserved that, but they think that they were, their parents were justified in doing it because it was their parents or it was some of their elders. Um, and it could have been easy for me to just stand there and be like, well, good for you. This was my life. I chose what to do, what I did. But without that wider sort of context, and that, I've always had a soft heart. I've always had empathy for other people, to my discredit and to many different pains
No.
in my life. Always had that level of empathy of being able to stand there and feel for somebody else, and stand there and think, you actually think that you deserved that to an extent because it was your elder or your parent. Even though, there's no excuse for a father to let his pregnant daughter stand out cold outside for a whole night. There is no excuse for that.
Mm. No,
But I've seen it constantly justified, not only by my family but within our communities. And I wish it would stop, and there aren't enough people talking about it, because I think there is this fear that if, for example, people like you who don't come from our background do talk about it, it will appear as if you are attacking, you're punching down because we are brown people and we're a minority and all of that stuff.
no. Like I said earlier, I want to understand the cultural aspects as to why it's become the way it's become, and so that people know, as odd a concept and as far as a concept as that can be, it would be more maddening if you didn't try to understand the reasoning behind it. And I say that term loosely. At the same time, it has. I've said this before when I had Stephen Woodford on my channel. I said culture, religion is fine up until the point it starts harming people. I don't care if you're brown, pink, blue with yellow stripes. If I think you're harming somebody for certainly for something as I find as something as unfounded as religion. And I know that carries a heck of a lot of weight. You can, the argument from tradition, you can say because something is very old, it should be revered. I don't believe that either. But I can understand the nature of why people carry that sort of weight with them. And, oh, no, you can't say anything about somebody's religion. Yes, I can, because physical harm, mental harm, emotional harm is a real world effect of these things we can't essentially prove. And until you cannot justify, in my mind, the physical harm you place on somebody else. And that goes from shunning the emotional side, to which I'm not stopping you from doing it, but I certainly can judge people for it, even whilst understanding why they might be doing it. It doesn't mean that because I understand it, I justify it. I can't believe I have to explain that, but it's the internet. But the physical aspects, whether it's down to beating for not memorizing the Quran in the right way, if it's FGM, if it's spousal abuse, if it's even things down to polygamy, which some might argue doesn't have any victims. How do we know? There's so many variants of what could be considered damaging behavior, but it's for what? We see the results. And it perpetuates, and that's what we're fighting again. I could be living next door to people who worship the great giraffe god Baloo, and I don't care what you believe. I care what you do and the actions you take. And to then say that I'm an immoral person for not believing in the great giraffe god, when that great giraffe god can, in some instances, lead you to behave in such an immoral way that it makes me wince. And
I think that,
sick into my stomach.
I think that religion and morality need to have a long awaited divorce, simply because religion is not moral in the slightest, because religious morality does not depend on what is right or wrong. Religious morality depends on who you obey. For example, with Islam, morality is all dependent on whether or not you obey Allah and his messenger. That is it. Whether or not what they say is correct is irrelevant. And to me, that does not scream morality, which is why when I was a Muslim, moral arguments never made a difference to me. It just never did, because to me, I equated morality with religion. And I think that there needed to be this long need to divorce the two terms, because I'm not entirely sure where those two terms started conjoining and meaning the same thing. I think it probably happened with Thomas Aquinas. He was a Christian and all of that stuff. I'm not entirely sure. I'm, again, not a philosopher, not an epistemologist. I don't know anything about that stuff. But for me, to equate morality and religion is to muddy the definition of morality. For me, I take terms like that very, very seriously. Again, to my own detriment. I've had many an argument about like different moral concepts at dinner tables, at birthday parties, because my moral standard, I don't really have one, if I'm being completely honest, because for me, everything is very, very subjective. I think that you need to consider things in the light of why things were done and how they were done and what the consequences of those actions were, and then you can give a ruling on them. I think that's the only way that you can be fair in in a court case or whatever. And that's certainly, I don't envy that position. It's not a position that I would want. Although often in a more informal sense, I'm often put in that position and I hate it. But it is something that is very, very tricky, and it's not something that you can define objectively. Like to say, for example, that, I don't know, drinking alcohol is completely immoral. Why? Why is it immoral to do that? Beating your spouse while you're drunk, yeah, I can agree, that is immoral. That is not correct. That is wrong, because you are causing harm with that act. But if you're just having a couple of pints with your mates in a pub, why is that considered immoral? In the context of Islam or other religions who might disallow drinking or whatever. I think that there has to be a wider discussion about everything, and maybe that makes things longer and harder and more difficult. But ultimately, I think that would amount to better living if people just considered the things that they did instead of just doing them without thinking. You know what I'm saying?
I think so. And sometimes when you say things like morality to the man on the street or to the woman on the street, it's very specific. What having good morals, having bad morals is a morality concept. It can, when you do get down to the epistemological side of things, and when you speak on it on a more in philosophical language, it's a huge.
That's why I don't like it. Fuck philosophy.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I like Nietzsche actually is because he disbands all of that, and he kind of talks he's a tedious writer, but he does disband all of the technical stuff.
Yeah.
And he kind of breaks it down to brass tacks, and it's very easy to understand. And also I feel as though if you have a more nihilistic concept, you have nothing, and you can kind of, you suddenly have the ability to think about all of things. Like, for example, I've had a constant struggle with whether or not I think meat is something immoral, or eating meat rather. And I've kind of come to the conclusion at this point in time, it may change in future, sure. And I think that is very important for human development. I think that anyone's opinion at a certain time, you have to allow it to be breathing room for change, and you can't accept it as something objective and something that will last until the end of time. But as of this time, I think I've come to the conclusion that I don't think that eating meat in particular is wrong. I think that eating meat is something that you can never categorize as completely immoral, because I don't think humanity will ever get to a point where we'll completely be able to disband meat. If such time occurs, and I'll be more than happy to opinion. As someone who's seen that kind of suffering within back home in Bangladesh, and also understands the concept of slaughtering animals, slaughtering a chicken or slaughtering something else, I do meat is something, take some sadistic pleasure in killing something. But I do not like the industry, and I do not like the monetization of meat. I think that is something that I don't agree with. Like, I just don't understand the buy and sell of it. And it's something that I've struggled with for, I think, above 4 or 5 years. And I think I've come to the conclusion that I don't like the buying and selling of it, and that's where I'm at. But yeah, I don't know. Whatever comment you want. I feel like I'm talking too much for this to be an interview with you, but go ahead.
No, I'm very surprised to hear you say that, because I remember watching you for a little while on a stream you did with David Worley way back. I think it was last year, and you said that you felt that there were bigger problems in the world than going vegan and stuff. I'm really summarizing what you're saying, but I thought, okay, she's sticking to her guns, and so to speak. But the change you've had in your thinking is really impressive, and I am not wary, but veganism to me is the more moral choice, is the more ethical choice. I can completely understand why it's difficult for people on so many different levels, and I don't really judge people for it. I did try veganism, got very sick, not veganism related, but I haven't technically gone back to it yet. Although I'm living a bit more plant-based, more now than I was before I became vegan for a while. Very confusing. But I think it's a modern day luxury to be able to have the choice. I don't blame societies and agricultural sort of cultures of old for thinking, gosh, that looks really yummy, let's put it on the fire. It was a survival thing. And so I think if you can, great. But I'm not, it's a lot to ask people. We have very few pleasures that we can rely on. In this, in these days, although there is lots of comforts, but there's sex and food. It's like the two ultimate pleasures. Not everybody has access to sex, but food is convenient. It's there. It's delicious.
It is.
Whatever need you need it to. And for somebody to come along and say, the last bastion of absolute pleasure, you now have to judge yourself. I'm sorry about that. Despite what I think of the argument, which I think is sound, I understand why people have difficulty with it. I really do. And you're gonna catch so many more, I hate to use this term, but it's true, so many more flies with honey than you will with vinegar. So these firebrand vegans are not helping.
Well, this is what I wanted to actually address a little bit, is that I've been to several vegan events. I support them. I used to back before I was slightly less broke than I am now, I used to donate to quite a few different causes. We have an event here in London that happens every year that I used to attend quite frequently with one of my cousins. And I learned a lot from there. And there were some things that I definitely onboarded. It was what, I watch a lot of, with fascination, with a grim sort of fascination. I do watch a lot of animals in factory farms content, because I think that it's necessary to understand the kind of sort of suffering that entails. And it is, while it is disturbing and it is something that a lot of people might not want to see, I think desensitizing yourself to that kind of reality is dangerous. Because I remember talking about me slaughtering animals and things like that to one of my significant others, one of my exes, and he immediately went, "Oh, that's so gross." And I sort of sat back and I thought, that's where your meat comes from. Where did you think? And he was like, "Well, I don't do that." And I was like, yeah, it's the exact fact that you don't do that you don't really understand the implication of you buying and eating meat, if that makes sense. I feel like if you do that yourself, you are now putting that sort of guilt or whatever responsibility you feel for that animal onto yourself, and you are able to retroactively think about it and process it and weigh up the pros and cons of doing that. I also think that like the mass sort of slaughter of animals is really abhorrent. So for example, back home, if you kill a cow back home, it lasts for like 7 months. Whereas here, when the meat industry does things like that, they are en masse killing animals to feed maybe, I don't even know how many people. There is, and I have made the argument in the past that I think veganism is something slightly more privileged for people who may not fully understand of people need to eat meat, or so for example, when I was back home, we needed to fish, we needed to kill our own meat, we needed to catch our own meat. It just would not be enough to fulfill our protein quota or whatever. And it is something that I do feel as though is in some way privileged, but I don't want to get into identity politics. It's just like useless argument. But veganism, I do support it. I find it extremely respectable. I do not, however, like the level of policing that some vegans go to. I do not particularly enjoy I think that if you make that choice, you do your best. That is how that works. If you are able to continue that diet, if you are able to do that, that is you going out of your way to make a choice that you think is more correct than another choice. And
Mhm.
I respect that on a very, very deep level. However, if you are unable to make that choice, I do not think that you should be reprimanded in any kind of way
Mm,
because you were unable to make it.
mm,
And I think that there are many people, within this sphere, within veganism, who are kind of bringing their people down
mm,
by being way too militant and policing their own people and saying that, oh,
mm.
you're not a real vegan, or you can't call yourself a vegan because you did this one thing, or you're wearing this kind of thing, or you're engaging in this kind of thing. It's just it feels really culty and very religious to me, and I really, really don't like that.
Yeah. If there's one thing I found to be something that I've struggled to get my head around, and something that I hope I never fall prey to, it's absolutism. Um,
Mm,
because it's perhaps more pig-headed than even fundamentalism,
yeah,
because at least there's
well, it's the same thing, really.
centuries of a fundamental sort of a structure being built in regards to religion or a cult or what have you. But when it comes to absolutism, it's usually from the people who consider themselves to be quite the skeptics,
Mm.
and therefore should have a more reasoned, logical approach, and yet will use absolute terms. And it's just so frustrating, because you'll have people and they have literally said and literally have been asked and responded by saying, I am a more moral person for not eating meat than you are for eating meat. Fine, they can say that. They have then gone on to say to people, and these are just examples that I've got from memory from Twitter, where they've told people to kill themselves for not following a vegan lifestyle.
It's not
So
very vegan of them, honestly.
part
It's not very vegan of them, honestly.
you don't say. I'm against suffering. Yeah, you have to sort of do it across the board, really, to really get it to catch on. But it's usually those people who make these absolute statements who then find themselves very, very open to hypocrisy without them perhaps even realizing it. The wonderful thing about morals and ethics is that it's often a drive that may come from an individual's decisions that could then affect a community, and then could, it could grow, conversations could be had, how can we do this, why is this immoral. I think even Cosmic Skeptic has said he believes that in the future, he doesn't believe people are bloodthirsty. He doesn't believe people enjoy the fact that animals are slaughtered. I don't think he's
Mm.
ever said that. But there is this sort of this disparity of being able to, and the cognitive dissonance of being able to say, I know exactly how meat is made, but because I don't see it, I don't necessarily have a moral urgency to solve the problem.
I
But it,
think it's necessary, honestly. I think it's necessary for anyone who eats meat to understand where their food comes from and how
yeah.
it's created.
Oh, absolutely.
Um,
And then the more you find out, the more you do think, I really did have my eyes closed to it. But I don't think people may joke and say, oh, yeah, but bacon. But we're not, I don't think we're a bloodthirsty people. We don't, uh, you know, I
I
don't,
think,
I think most people would gladly eat somebody's asked, would you eat lab created meats if you're a vegetarian or vegan?
yeah,
Although I'm not a vegan. Tomorrow, there's nothing in me that says I must have the blood of a cow in me. I must taste the flesh of a pig. It's not
I
an
think
ego thing with me.
humans collectively, I think because we are ultimately animals, there is a streak of ruthlessness in us.
Mm,
But I don't know. I really don't know. I don't think that the majority of people are out here just trying to kill animals for fun. Um, I just don't think that that's the case.
no.
So yeah, but
In terms
we
of
have that question up on screen.
mm, mm,
We do have that question up on screen. Would you eat lab created meats if you're a vegetarian or a vegan? I
yeah,
don't know actually.
really,
Yeah, I don't really know. Um um I I would have to research into it. I would have to like watch a couple of videos and see how it's created. I
mm,
think that there could be some, I don't know, maybe it's just my residual religiosity, this distrust for science. Um but I would need to research it a significant amount. I did the same thing before starting medication, any kind of medication. I did the same thing. I needed to research the shit out of it before I even thought. And my doctor was very like, okay, well, here's the prescription. You do your research, and if you want to take them, you take them. He just didn't even bother asking. He didn't bother pressing because he knows me very well. But yeah, I think I would have to research the hell out of it before I actually went ahead and decided to eat it. But I mean, if there's no pain, no suffering involved, probably.
Mm.
Hmm.
Well, it's funny. I think again, it's one of those things where I don't think people perhaps realize it, but our food, for good or ill, is messed with on so many different levels before it reaches the supermarket. I don't want it to sound nefarious. What I mean is that obviously there are
I
pesticides,
agree.
yeah, pesticides and things like that that are used that are in fact incredibly helpful, but they do have an effect on the produce that you then get. So, you'll have people say, oh, I can't possibly use sort of shampoo with parabens in it and stuff, but then we'll eat a, sort of chemical laden piece of chicken, depending on how it was processed. So it's funny what we'll sort of put our noses up to and sort of
I
deny
mean, I'm
happens.
someone who still delights in conspiracy theories. I don't necessarily believe in them, but I still delight in them. Like, I still find them interesting. And it was a massive part of my life before was like looking into these conspiracy theories and finding more and more information because it's kind of a bottomless pit when you're looking at nothing. So yeah, for me, like when I first heard of it, it wasn't even in Dave Worley's podcast that I'd first heard of it. But when I'd first heard of it, I was a teenager, and I was like, "There's no, they're just trying to put stuff in our bodies and stuff like that." And I still think there's a voice in the back of my head that feels that way. But she needs a certain level of policing anyway.
No. I have a friend who actually grew up wanting to be a pig farmer, and she's a tiny little thing. So I just felt like, oh my god, she's going to get absolutely eaten by these pigs. But no, she's gone on to a very prestigious farming university and all these sorts of things, and she's a great animal lover. But at the same time, completely understands the slaughter aspect and the milking aspect of things as a part of farming. But she said, and it's not this conspiracy as such. It's more down to the guidelines. But she said, don't trust anything that it says organic unless you've grown it yourself, because there's only a certain amount of guidelines that they have to follow, and a certain percentage that something has to be deemed organic for it then to be labeled organic. So it's just things like that where people people want to know what they're putting in their bodies. I'm not saying they don't, but we're not always told, or we don't always understand the sort of the chemicals behind it and things like that, most of which are actually necessary. But then there's cosmetic things as well, like American eggs, I believe, are bleached to make them white. Why? I don't know, but that's a process to go through.
I mean, oranges are also genetically modified to be orange. They're actually naturally they occur as red, but because they're called oranges, they are genetically modified to be orange.
Wow. I think I've heard something similar of bananas. There's the ways that we
bananas as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And yet,
but it is, if it sells, this is the whole thing. Like, I don't necessarily have a problem with capitalism or consumerism, but there is something really strange to me in my brain anyway, because I kind of grew up in this like grassroots family where we weren't, I wouldn't call us self-sufficient because we weren't, but there was a certain level of like, we sewed our own clothes, we slaughtered our own meat, we grew a lot of our own produce. Like for me, it's a bit strange when I think about things like people, obviously not people buying food, but like this whole appeal of, oh, this food looks more appealing, so therefore I'm going to buy it, rather than this is food, therefore I'm going to eat it. Like it's
again, another modern problem, or a modern.
I mean, I talk like I didn't grow up in a first world country, but when I did, but it baffles me sometimes. But anyway, next question. Do you know the concept of speciesism? What are your thoughts about it? I don't know what speciesism is. What is it? Do you know what it is?
I think if I'm remembering correctly, it's it's sort of almost like a, I don't want to say a racial term, but it's not necessarily pejorative either. It's the idea that we hold our own species, obviously humans, up to a higher standard in terms of not necessarily the food chain, but that we see animals as less than, if I'm correct. So, you know,
Right.
yeah.
I think for me, I'm extremely biased, and I have no problem saying that I'm extremely biased. I will hold. So, in terms of speciesism, I do think that I would hold humans to a different standard to animals. Um, just because I'm not entirely sure. It's probably to do somewhat to do with my raising in religion, but also just because I don't think it's feasible to be able to hold animals to the same standard because we don't fully understand them.
Mhm.
Um, but the other thing is that there are certain animals that I do hold above other animals, and I know that that's bad. I know that I'm biased for doing that. I will hold dogs above all other animals because I love them. But I also understand that that is, widely interpretable. People who aren't dog people will not have that same standard,
Mhm.
People who are terrified of dogs will not hold that same standard. I
Mhm.
hold octopuses to the same standard as dogs. It just would not fly in my ideal world.
Mhm.
What do you think? Do you have any?
Like you said, it's we still don't understand a great deal of their their cognitive, their sentience, their cognitive abilities. I wouldn't necessarily say that my ability to care for something or my empathy for something or to find something interesting rests it's solely on whether they are, sentient
Alive or not?
or cognitively, very advanced. I can care about a great many things that might seem more basic than a human. But I also appreciate that it's my perspective I'm putting on a subjective thing about dogs as well.
Mm,
It's all the sort of the love and things that they may experience on a dog level, but because we don't understand that, we can certainly find common ground with them and closeness and things like that, and
mm,
the feeling of perhaps loneliness and stuff, or at least that's how we see it. A dog will be very excited to see you, perhaps they were lonely, but we put our human spin on these sorts of things.
mhm,
But it doesn't make me wonder that the more we find out about animals and their sentience and their ability to feel pain and stuff like that, whether that's obviously biological or whether that's just a purely, it's not necessarily a purely philosophical question, but often that comes up, if an animal can feel pain, is it right to and all this? But if retrospectively in 50 years, we find out, retrospectively that animals have been able to know exactly what's been going on this whole time, it will seem like this absolutely horrific thing
oh, that would be a mind fuck.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. We'd all be guilty, unless you were sort of vegan from birth. Um,
yeah.
it's
Even then, like stepping on ants,
exactly.
fucking
Oh my God.
snails, like
Yeah.
it's a lot to take in, is what I'm
Yeah.
saying. Um, we have quite a few questions actually, which is fun. I know we've been going for almost 2 hours. Um,
Stop talking to you, drunkie.
I'm at this point, I'm practically sober. Uh,
I've sobered you up. I'm so sorry.
it's fine. What is a resource which people who have experienced shunning need when they are out alone and exposed? What can we do to build a safety net or community for it? It's really difficult because shunning occurs in a lot of forms. So um, you have so there are different levels of shunning. Certainly you have ostracism, which is just like verbal abuse and constantly telling you that you're wrong, and that you don't feel the way that you feel, gaslighting and all of that stuff. You have physical abuse, which has varying levels, and then you have outright we're going to kill you, which is at that point it's just get out of that house as soon as possible. um, I think that the best thing, I can only speak for myself. I think that it would be very irresponsible for me to give any sort of particular targeted advice for everyone, but I can only speak for myself. The one thing that got me out of that and kept me kind of sane was having a community that I could talk to and making friends. So I certainly think that having an online community for people who are shunned and people who can share their experiences without any shame or without any, guilt being carried, I think is really, really important. Do you have anything to add, Kelly?
Well, you are certainly more of an authority on that than I. I think perhaps just speaking from a empathetic level and a humanistic level, the idea that whilst being shunned is obviously a very painful thing that can occur to you, it's probably the fear of no longer being part of the community, which could be just as damaging and can have long-term effects. So the idea that you should seek out those not only have gone through the same thing as you, but it's okay to seek another community. And that's where things like obviously the ex-Muslims North America and other charities and other organizations can help, is because they understand that it's not from jumping from one thing to another. There is a transition period, and there's all sorts of mental gymnastics and hoops and things like that you'll find other people have gone through as well. So just feeling not.
I think Kelly's frozen there. Not
The
entirely.
alternative is different.
Sorry, you froze for a second.
Oh no! Oh, sorry. I was traveling as usual.
You're on one.
Yeah, I think that's the only thing I can say is don't become insular. Don't think that just because you've come out of one community that might have been damaging, that they're all like that. And to seek out people who've obviously gone through what you've gone through, and to don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to put your lack of a better term faith in humanity again. But do so tentatively. Take time for yourself first, and then seek out those who've gone through it themselves, because you won't be the only one, and it can apply to so many different religions and cults, and yet you all have very similar stories likely. So just be brave. You're already brave enough for considering what you're considering. Shunning obviously can come against your wishes, but it's usually a catalyst of what you've already been thinking, which is that you're no longer part of the faith. You don't feel the same way you used to. You don't follow the same rituals and practices that the rest of your family does, and it'd be so much more damaging to yourself to stay in that just for the sake of family or community, when there's so many others out there that would gladly accept you for who you truly are. So that's all I can say about that.
Please do, if you are in a situation where you think you could be harmed physically, and or if your life is in danger, please do utilize the social services. Please do utilize the police. Do not wait for it to get better. It doesn't. And it's not worth waiting for it. I really want to bring that point home, because I just wish I'd done it earlier. That's the tea on that, really. Would you eat human meat if it was created in a lab and no one was hurt?
Oh.
I'm not sure why.
No, I mean, well, oh gosh, now we're going to get into another philosophical discussion in terms of personhood. It's
would it have a soul?
No, sod that. Sod the soul aspect. No, I just see, now this is the thing, isn't it? You'd know that either even just on a cellular level, that it was coming from somewhere. So I don't know. It would have to depend entirely on the nature of its composition, I think. I
don't think I would ever feel right about eating a human being, even if it was grown in a lab. I think the only situation that I would eat human meat is for survival.
Yeah, if history tells us anything, I think we're all capable of that in some aspect, if we get really desperate.
And the final question in that series of questions is: would you eat lab meat if it was generated from your own tissue?
Wow, wow, how can? Ooh, I'm sure it would taste
I
fantastic.
I'd
Um,
do it on a dare. I'd do it on a dare, but not actively.
well, I think there's quite a few biological issues there as
Is
to
that,
whether or not it'd actually be healthy in terms of
I mean, you
cannibalism.
do it once for a dare. I'm sure it's
Yeah.
fine.
Um, this is such a strange
I'm
conversation.
not. I'm not a scientist. Don't take my advice and don't follow my example.
Yes, if
Um,
I were able to, if it was the way that I would have to eat human flesh, or had the choice to eat human flesh, and I said yes to that, how could I say no to my own produce?
oh, ew.
My own brand, you know.
So just getting this image of people who eat their own placentas.
Yeah, yeah. No comment on that.
So Ish says, "Is this is a Dillahunty question? Would you eat accidental roadkill?"
Well, as a meat eater, I don't think there's
Mm,
many things I wouldn't eat. That came out wrong. What I mean is, as
somebody's going to edit that.
a oh Christ, this whole stream has been yeah, a gold mine. No, yeah, I don't. I think yeah,
I
yeah,
think it would be a waste not to eat it. That would be
yeah.
my. That would be my. That would be the thing that haunts me. Like I wouldn't just want to bury it. Um, I don't know. It would depend. First of all, it would depend on the roadkill.
Yeah.
If it's a human being, probably not. Um, it. I don't know. I don't know. There's a lot of variables there. But if it was like a deer or something, I would feel bad about not eating it because it would feel like it was a waste.
I think this question is more aimed at people who are on the fence in regards to meat eating.
Mm,
It's because as a meat eater, of course, why wouldn't you? Unless you found it a bit icky that you actually saw the animal first, perhaps
yeah,
before it
but
died.
I would see like just my
Yeah,
tiger mom coming out. It would just be like,
yeah.
that's weak. Yeah.
It's a far more visceral thing to see it dead in front of you than rather wrapped and ready for you to eat. You know, it's perhaps you might have a questionable response to it, but in that nature. But the actual concept of eating its flesh shouldn't be that much different, except you'd have to skin it and things. So it's as a meat eater, I'd eat its meat, but I may find it somewhat more icky than just go
I
down
think that learning how to it sound awful, but learning how to skin and kill an animal is a survival trait that I'm glad that I learned.
Well, yeah, I mean, that probably would come in handy in a great many instances, but luckily,
Not so much in not so much in the modern world, but it
no,
is something that I'm glad I have the knowledge bank for,
yeah.
if that makes sense. I'm just looking
No,
for more questions.
no, no, I appreciate that, definitely.
A lot of people are complimenting me on my lip paint. Uh,
Well,
Thank you. It's black lip with highlighter on top. It's a nifty trick for anyone who wants to steal it. Um, or eyeshadow works as well.
mhm.
Uh, I've been. I don't think there's many more questions. Do you have any final thoughts? Because I've kept you. I feel like I've kept you for long enough.
Oh, wow,
Um,
it's getting late, isn't it? No, I think we might have wanted to touch on the reason I've been away a little.
Go for
Only,
it.
only because I feel like I owe those who might not be in the know a bit of an explanation. Not that I've been greatly missed, but just in the sense of, I've met some wonderful people in this community, and I didn't want it to seem like I was just, you know, not conversing with them and not being part of the community. And I, you know, when something happens, you don't feel like you should send a complete bulletin out to everyone. But at the same time, I didn't want them to think ill of me because I hadn't perhaps responded to a message or anything like that. So yeah, I'm at a bit of a crossroads with my channel at the moment because as much as I do enjoy it, and I enjoy it a great deal, and it's been an amazing challenge, I have genuinely come to a point now where I have to think either I deliberately get bigger or I stop. And because I've deliberately not allowed myself to get bigger, that sounds odd, but I haven't promoted myself a great deal. I haven't been on streams and things like that aside from tonight.
Yeah, I think this is the first one in a long time.
Yeah, it is in a long time that I've been the guest on. It's just that as oh gosh, I'm not articulate tonight at all.
It's okay.
So the reason I initially went away for a little while is just to have a little bit of a break anyway, but was I did a video it was late October, I want to say. I can't exactly remember when it was. A video on a topic that I thought was, you know, pretty fringe in terms of philosophy, pretty basic understanding of it, and I made the YouTubers or skeptical YouTubers ultimate sinful act was that I didn't assume people would be that bothered, and what I meant to say is that they didn't. I didn't realize there was an entire community based around a particular philosophical school of thought. Because when I think of philosophy, in my very
what school of thought is this?
Sorry, antinatalism. Which some people may have heard of it. I'm surprised at how many people have actually heard of it.
What is that like against having children?
It's fundamentally, if I'm able to explain, is basically that it is not a moral choice to have children, and there's varying reasons why. Some people go for the aspect of consent, that you can't ask a child whether or not they want to be born. Of course, that has so many different.
This is such a first world argument.
I know, I know. But at the same time, I have some empathy with why they might think that. The other one, in terms of, you know, like if you are born into an abusive family, you know, what I was saying earlier, that parents have an absolute responsibility to bring their child into the most stable life that they can offer. And it doesn't mean fabulous wealth. And, you know, there's often the best things that you can give a child that cost nothing at all. And those are the things that create really awesome people: love, empathy, affection, understanding, all these things that, you know, don't cost a penny except for your time.
I've also seen horrible conditions breed wonderful people as well. I mean, myself.
Absolutely.
Myself, example.
Yeah.
But yeah, I see their argument, but did you like post a video against that?
Well, what happened was, well, actually, what I dealt with, I didn't even deal with the consent issue, because whenever I had, I did sort of a bit of research and stuff, and a lot of the research I did was based around news stories of people talking about who themselves were antinatalists, and they seemed fairly nice people. They just had this particular worldview, and I found it intriguing, and I thought, oh, this is interesting, it's a bit different. And as somebody who holds being a parent the responsibility in quite high esteem, I understood where they were coming from, where you know, you have this ultimate responsibility. It's your choice to bring a child into this world, and I'd never argue against it. But what I took issue with was the idea, and in my video I explained all the reasons why you know, you really have to think about having children. Do you have a genetic disease? Financially, are you stable? And all the reasons why bringing children to this world might not be the best decision for you. But I don't agree that it's an immoral act across the board. I believe there's an ethical question, and there's lots of ethical things to think about. But it's not something I find immoral. No. But the other aspect was the fact that there is there's no positives. It's really hard to explain without getting really down and dirty into philosophy. But to anybody listening, the idea is that there's not enough good in life to warrant the gamble it would involve to bring a child into it. And some proponents, depending on how far they sort of go down the rabbit hole, will say, even if you lived a wonderful life and you had a paper cut, would the pain of that paper cut be worth? Do you know what I mean? The sort of balance to it. Some of them are that absolutist, and others are just saying, well, you can't guarantee that your child won't suffer this, and you can't guarantee your child won't suffer that.
I can't stand absolutism.
I know. Well, I said earlier,
literally can't stand it.
Unfortunately, when I made my video without knowing this community exists, and I do mean a community, without knowing they exist, and I'm not the only one. There is other.
I can't really blame you for not knowing. That's such a niche community.
With other philosophical concepts, I can imagine people getting heated debates and heated, conversations, and say, "Well, I'm a this, I'm a that, I'm a consequentialist, I'm a da 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 da." But I can't. And perhaps having a duel, I don't know. To me, duels still take place. Yeah, okay. But it's something I can imagine people getting passionate about, but not holding it necessarily as a worldview. And these people, the people reacting, it's almost as if I literally slit a baby's throat. Their reaction was so visceral and so over, I don't want to say over the top, but it was really over the top, and came as a wave upon wave upon wave. There was a couple of people in there who I think saw the nature of the video, and much to perhaps their annoyance, there was a light-hearted aspect to the video as well. I included pictures of babies, and I mentioned Peppa Pig, and I wasn't poking fun at them because I didn't know they existed. I was just sort of making a balance, attempting to make a balanced view. Whilst I don't think it's immoral to have children, I do think it's a highly ethical question that has to be, given its due and given its the gravitas of the decision to make. And I felt like I'd expressed that. Unfortunately, people who hold it as an absolute worldview, no wonder they took offense, but they did. And I just wasn't expecting it. If I had been expecting, if I knew this community existed, I still believe that now. I don't believe in their worldview. No matter whether it's the consent argument, the argument from pleasure against pain, or suffering, rather, I should say, I still don't believe it. I've suffered myself, and I would gladly suffer through it again for what I have now. It's just, and vice versa. I'm a big fan of the human condition, human experience.
I think suffering is just part and parcel of living.
Yes, yeah, but to them,
can't really.
No, you can't. And it's not something when it's coming. It can seem very indiscriminate. A cold universe. It doesn't really care about you. But
saying, well, your child might.
Yeah. So in a sense,
it's essentially like saying, oh, your child might die one day. Like, yeah, that's the point.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what.
Sorry, am I lagging a little?
Just a wee smidge. Yeah. Basically, they were saying things like, you brought your daughter into this world, or child, sorry, because I don't think I mentioned that she was my daughter. So they said you brought her into the world to be raped and tortured. And I was just like, where do you think I live? What do you think is happening here?
What?
And no, and that was one of the nicer comments. It was the most bizarre.
That's something.
Yeah.
That is something horrible to say to a parent.
Of course it is. But they know exactly. Obviously, I'm not the first person they've encountered. They call us breeders, because apparently we just breed without any sort of thinking about it. Some people might not, but yeah. I'm laughing about it now, but it was really like, whoa. And you know what? At first, I thought, there's a level of parental fear that if you're a good parent that you have, I've got to make sure that I care for my child. I make them, I keep them warm, I keep them fed, I keep them loved, I prepare them for life. So it did tap into me the reminder of the enormous responsibility I have, which was always there. But what I think bothered me most was that I shared the planet with people who, beyond misanthropy, think that the human race, historically, and I'm assuming into the future, is a mistake, is a virus, is just
Oh,
no point to it. So how can you argue with people like that? And my problem is that because I was so surprised by all this, I then went on to Grey Skeptic's channel for a quick stream about it.
mhm.
And of course, at the time,
Would have been proud.
I had a more basic level understanding of it. And so I was responding to their responses, not necessarily to antinatalism as a whole. And of course, that pissed them off as well. So I still haven't looked at any of the comments on Grey Skeptic's channel, but I'm sure they're not favourable. And of course, I've had videos made about me where I'm sure they use statistics to say how likely somebody is to suffer from this disease, how likely they are to suffer from this.
Yeah, but I mean that just the whole okay. This is I don't want to get into a conversation about antinatalism because I already have enough death threats. Thank you very much. But I do want to say that it is extremely defeatist to say, oh, just because you might be doing, you know what I'm saying, like something might occur that you shouldn't do something. It's extremely defeatist, and I don't appreciate that in the slightest.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand the argument. I've had sort of the same pattern of thought. I've sort of gone through my head, like, is it moral to have a child, especially when there are children who currently do not have parents? I'm still on the wavelength that if I'm able to adopt, that I would prefer to do that. But I mean, that's just me, you know. I would not, I would never deign to put that on anybody else. And I think that's the major problem I have with any kind of religion or philosophy, is that there's this bizarre need to bring people over to your side when you don't need to do that.
No.
Like, it's just not necessary. But that would be the reason why you disappeared off the internet for a little while.
Yeah, seemed like forever. Well, only because obviously I was surprised, and I left the actual video up for several months. It was up for 4 months, which in internet years is 8,764 years. So it's not like I was sort of denying, that I'd made the video and I wanted to hide away, because I believed in then, and I still believe now, my position. I don't think it's immoral to have children. But I did stop the comments because they were getting so just sick, really sickening, some of them. And it's a shame, because some people had genuine questions that I felt they were sort of responding to the video rather than seeing it as this pro-natalist, yay breeder sort of propaganda.
I wasn't even aware that protein.
I know. It's where's my vocabulary I never had before, and I kind of dislike that they're in my vocabulary now.
I'm so sorry, Kelly. Like, when people tell me things like this, the immediate thought I have is, this is why we need a catastrophe. Get your priorities together. Like, how much time do you have on your hands that you can argue about whether or not it's just not why I had a problem with arguing about veganism. It seemed such a non-issue at the time. I still consider it a non-issue. I still think that there are bigger problems that we should be dealing with that aren't being dealt with. It's such a. I just don't imagine, for example, if I was sitting back home in Bangladesh, that we would be having this conversation.
No.
I just don't imagine. I'm not saying it's not necessary. I'm not saying it's not important.
No.
I'm not saying you can't have the discussion, but I do think that it's a little. You're very bored. You see what I'm saying? Like, I don't know.
Absolutely, and I think that's why I was surprised. Just the absolute. I keep being surprised by the absolute nature of people who hold absolute ideas and fundamentalists, and I keep being surprised, and that's on me. But it's more the case of once I discovered them, there's a pattern, a very distinct pattern that seems to occur, not with all of them. And I said this in Grey Skeptic stream. I said, I don't think all of them are this vitriolic and certainly very cowardly in what they were saying. I doubt they hold their ideals up to such high esteem that they would say them to my face. But then that's the internet, I suppose. But you know, because they don't know from an 8-minute video what kind of mother I am, who I am. I could be beating my children. They could be exactly right and say that you are immoral for bringing your child into this world. But what I did find was a pattern of people who were expressively, and I don't want to say anything against nihilism because I find it an interesting concept, but were, you know, class themselves as nihilist.
Nihilism definitely has its downside.
It can do, but only fueled by likely what introduced them to it in the first place.
Yes. I mean, I find a significant degree of positivity in it because having such a sort of solid, I don't know, I made a video on it, if you guys want to watch it, but having such a solid, you know, concept of what my life should be and how I should live my life, it is extremely freeing to be able to sort of build up from nothing. So I would consider myself an existential nihilist in a lot of senses. But there is definitely just people who take it to like this weird memey place. You know what I'm saying? Like they kind of use it as like this jacket to make themselves look hard, or like, you know what I'm saying?
I think if playing devil's advocate, if I can use that term, it's more a case, I think, if something speaks to you on an emotional level, as rational as you probably feel that you are, you are naturally, I think, just going to be attracted to things that speak to you on an emotional level, and they can be the harder things to crack, as we know, you know. But it's or at least to see clearly on. And like I said, for a lot of these people, from what I've read, seem to have come from very abusive families, or are people who are I don't want to say naturally pessimistic, but just the tones. Like if you go into a forum where they're talking, it's the darkest place on the internet. And I've spent time on an incel forum, and they're like the cheerleaders compared to these guys.
That's why I don't really mind them coming here, because I do feel like sometimes they just need somewhere to let it out, and that's fine. And I do, from time to time, you will see my feed just covered in them. They're just here to have a good time, essentially. And this is the like, I remember being in that place where, you know, spitting something vile at someone else was the only way that I could sort of feel a sense of pleasure. So I kind of sympathize with that, and I allow it. Maybe it's a bad choice, I don't know, but I like the concept of, you know, free speech and letting everyone say what they have to say and getting it off their chest. I think it's healthier for people.
Absolutely. I think what antinatalism has going against itself, aside from being quite perhaps a dark worldview, they wouldn't agree with that. I think a lot of them, from the ones that I've had experience with. I know a couple of really lovely antinatalists actually that I met through this. So I'm almost glad it happened, because I met some really interesting people who hold absolute, I don't want to say absolute views. They hold a lot of the tenets of antinatalism very seriously, and we disagree vehemently, but they can have a conversation. They can understand the nuance of why I don't think all life is suffering. Whereas a lot of them, it's an absolute thing, and I just can't get my head around that.
That is called maturity, to be able to have a conversation with someone you disagree with and continue being just fine. But I also wanted to add briefly before we close this out, is that I do think that the internet has a way of being more vitriolic towards women, and this is not like a feminist spiel, like I'm not that kind of person, but I do think that the internet has a way of being more sort of volatile and vitriolic towards women as compared to men, just from what I've seen from the communities that I deal with. There is a certain user that I am in close contact with now, one of my closest friends now, but he is male, and he sort of presents as, his account presents as female, because he loves Ariana Grande, he's a gay man, and he has found, I mean, this could be purely anecdotal, I'm not entirely sure, I haven't conducted a study, but he has found that on his normal account, where he presents as a male, he is not treated with the same kind of vitriol as he is on his account where he presents as female. And I do think that the internet has a way of holding women to a much higher standard for like intelligence and the ability to be, you know, more well thought, well researched, all of that stuff as compared to men. I don't know if you found the same thing, but that's just what I've seen. Like for me, for example, when I see, I mean, it might just be within my community and the people that we talk to, but when these sort of highbrow, educated, quote unquote, educated, scholarly people come after myself and come after one of my male counterparts, they will argue sort of rationally with these male counterparts, but when it comes to me, they will look down on me and they'll call me a failure and they will call me, oh, you're just emotional and things like that. And it might just be, you know, Islam and that mentality of women being not as intelligent and all of that stuff. But it is also a harsher criticism, as Zara said actually here. She said that it's not necessarily intelligence, but it could be holding women to a harsher criticism than men. I don't know if you found that to be the same thing. I mean, feel free to enlighten us on that.
I think perhaps I'm one of the lucky few that I don't think, unless it's gone over my head, but I don't think I've had a reaction that's felt pointedly so that it seems like they're attacking my ideas as a woman. They might be attacking my ideas even in a silly fashion, you know, that they don't actually have a decent argument. But I've always felt like it was the argument they were attacking and not me.
Okay.
I had something obviously
That's
sexist,
good.
obviously misogynist. I don't think that's happened. Even with the antinatalist thing, I think the only reason they went as far as they did is because I'm a mother. I literally grew this poor soul that was dragged into this world. So
I
I'm
thought
like
she's doing fine.
evil. Yeah, like the ultimate evil.
Well, this is what I thought. Like maybe because you're a woman and you're the actual
No, I think that they
problem.
they think anybody who can create life sucks. Not all of them think that,
Okay.
but, you know, a lot of them.
Fair enough. Okay,
Yeah.
fair enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's close this out. So you have a channel. Someone asked ages ago. You have a channel. Would you like to show your channel, what you do on your channel? Just talk to us a little bit about it, and we can have some final comments and a closeout.
Yes, I do have a channel, Topic Thunder, and it's Topic Thunder, not Tropic Thunder, the movie. It will ask you if that's what you mean, but you don't. I'm also on Twitter, and I much prefer you to have conversations with me over there, and that's where I found some really fruitful conversations happening. YouTube comments I don't tend to read more past the first day a video goes up. So if you want to engage, Twitter's the way to go, and that's Topic Thunder 1. I'm also on Facebook as Topic Thunder as well. Yeah, it's evolved from atheist content to philosophical content to mental health stuff.
She also has an Instagram.
I do have an Instagram. Pictures, yes. How do you?
Mama has an Instagram.
Oh yeah. I look forward to every post. Yeah, so under Topic Thunder again, but yeah, just know that, you know, every video I make, it's not going to be rocket science, but it's I love paying attention
it's always
to it.
insightful. Mum always makes an insightful video. And we needed you back on the internet, to be fair, because there's too much angry content, there's too much nonsense. Sometimes we just want something intelligent, and you know, sometimes we just want to watch our mum talk about something clever, you know. I mean, I'm all day every day I'm posting some kind of nonsense. Sometimes I'll do something intelligent, I'll bring someone intelligent on so I can bounce that intelligence off somebody, because I can't be too serious for too long. I just don't think that life is that serious. But it's good to have you back, and I'm glad to see you come back.
Oh, thank
and
you.
I hope you put us some content soon.
Yes, yeah. I only went away just to reassess and to really think about what happened, so that the next time, this happens, I'm not quite so surprised. So that's a little bit on me. I wasn't quite prepared for it.
I don't
But
know.
yes.
I think that everyone has that curve with the internet where they
Mm.
get their first sort of full backlash. I mean, mine was very early on, so
Yeah.
I'm over it at this point. I'm practically a veteran at this point. But yeah, I think everyone has their curve and everyone needs a timeout. Like even myself, I took a timeout over Christmas because I just thought, what's the point? I'll post a video every week, but I'm not going to post anything serious. There's no point in me doing that. I'm going to have a good time. It's Christmas,
Mm.
and I think it's really, really important to be able to, be able to reframe where you're at mentally and
Mm.
make sure that you're comfortable doing what you do because
Mm.
ultimately this isn't something you have to do. This is something you want to do,
Mhm.
and to feel like you have to do it is really shitty, I think.
Mm.
So yeah, I'm glad you took the time out, but it's time for a comeback. It's time for, Slim Shady's comeback. Um, um, but yeah, thank you
Mm.
for coming onto my channel and having this discussion. I had a wonderful time. I felt like I talked too much. My
No,
interviews,
lovely.
generally speaking, in the last few interviews I've done, I haven't spoken as much, but it also feels like I haven't spoken to you in a long time. So it did feel like we were reconnecting a little, and yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but any final comments you have, go for it, and then I'll end the broadcast.
Yeah, just thank you for everyone for joining us. And I've been sort of looking at the chat, and it's been, aside from a couple of obvious trolls, or perhaps one obvious troll, it's been rather lovely. I'm always wondering if there's going to be something mean in the chats about me, but c'est la vie. No, it's been wonderful. You have some great people in your chats, and
I do. And
yeah,
I'm
it
I'm
really are.
actually quite surprised with the people who turned up. They're not my regulars. Maybe I should do live streams at this time more often. Because I've been going up and down with when I post and who's in the chat, and I kind of like the mix up. I don't like seeing the same people over and over again. I do have some obvious regulars like Ishaq Hussein, like Marcus Tambek. They're my regulars, and deeply appreciate you guys. Thank you for turning up. But it's nice to see some fresh blood and some new people. And it's good to have different people participate. So I really, really enjoyed that. But anyway, thank you guys for joining us. Make sure you like, share. For those of you who did share, thank you so much. Subscribe if you want to. I'm trying to get to 2,000 by the end of summer. Hopefully passing Ali Dawa by the end of the year, but we'll leave that target for another time. 2,000 by the end of summer. If you can help me get there, I would deeply appreciate it. And I will see you for another video tomorrow. Nick joined us right at the end. Thank you for joining. I'm sure you can slide back and watch the whole discussion. It's been a very enlightening one, and thank you for coming on. I've it's been really good. I've discovered some new things about myself. And yeah, it's always a good time talking to you, Kelly.
You always continue to inspire me, so thank you.
Oh. Stop it. But yeah, thank you, and goodbye.
And good night.